This lecture is on bacteria. Bacteria is a large domain of prokaryotic organisms. Way back at the beginning of the semester, we mentioned prokaryotic organisms. These are organisms that do not have a nucleus, which also means they're going to be single-celled organisms. There's a ton of diversity in bacteria. Not all of them cause disease. In fact, a lot of them turn out to be beneficial. Beneficial bacteria, there are two big categories that we understand a fair bit about when we talk about good bacteria. One is bacteria in the soil, which are important for plant growth. The other are the beneficial bacteria that make up a large part of the microbiome. So the microbiome includes all of the organisms, including bacteria, that live on or inside our bodies and either don't harm us or benefit us in some way. So it includes bacteria, fungi, archaea, some microscopic mites, and it makes up around half of the cells in the human body. But it makes up a much larger part of the genetic diversity in our body. So what do I mean by this? So in your cells, you have genes that do a lot of the things that we need to survive. But in the microbiome, the bacteria and other organisms have genes that we don't have that can do things that help us. Now, the study of the microbiome is a relatively new science. It wasn't that long ago that we thought all bacteria were bad. And now we know there are lots of bacteria that live on us that are not harmful, and some of them do benefit us. So I'm just going to mention a couple of ways that we have discovered that these bacteria help us. In the digestive tract, microbes, bacteria largely, make vitamins that we need. The example on this slide are vitamin K, which is important for blood clotting, and vitamin B12. Microbes in our digestive tract and on our skin can compete with potentially infectious organisms. We think that our microbiome helps train our immune system. Now, if our immune system, which you probably know is our primary defense against infectious diseases, if our immune system doesn't work right, then bacteria in the microbiome can go bad and cause infections. Anything that causes an infection or disease is called pathogenic. And these are the bacteria we have studied the best. These are things like food poisoning, pneumonia, there's viral or bacteria pneumonia, staph infections, which includes MRSA, as seen in my friend Stephanie here. You see that long scar down her arm? She got a MRSA infection, started in the tip of her finger, and she ended up losing the tip of her finger and having to have multiple surgeries where they went in and physically removed infectious and dead tissues. Ugh. You can get tetanus. There are several sexually transmitted diseases that are bacterial. Gonorrhea, chlamydia, syphilis. If you think you have a sexually transmitted disease, please go see your doctor. Untreated, these can be really nasty, but they can be treated. So how do bacteria cause disease? Well, there's a lot of different things they can do. They can compete with your cells for nutrients. They can get inside of your cells and kill the cells from the inside. They can produce harmful waste products or even toxins. The deadliest toxin that we know about is botulinum toxin. This is produced by one of the bacteria that causes food poisoning. It is lethal at an incredibly low dose, somewhere between 2 and 30 nanograms. Okay, and I know most of you are probably going, I have no idea how small a nanogram is. Well, I've got the conversion on here. If you know what an ounce is, a nanogram is, you see all those zeros? It's a lot smaller than an ounce. And if you don't know what an ounce is, there are 16 ounces in a pound. And the average size bag of flour is 5 pounds. So that should give you an idea of how tiny an amount of botulinum toxin can be fatal. And yes, botulinum toxin is what's in Botox. Now, this is tetanus. It's another bacterial infection, and again, there's a toxin being produced that interferes with the normal function of what are called motor neurons. It causes uncontrolled muscle contractions. These can be strong enough that they break your bones. Now, the bacteria that produces tetanus is not spread from person to person, but it's usually caused if you get a deep puncture wound. Death can either be by what's called pulmonary embolism, where a blood clot gets in your lungs and destroys lung tissues, or just respiratory failure. There is no cure. If the tetanus toxin is in you, all that can be done is supportive care, give you a post-exposure vaccine, and treat you with what are called an antitoxin, which stops more toxin from causing problems, but doesn't stop the problems that are already there. And then you wait for the patient's immune system. Tetanus is preventable. You get a vaccine. You need a booster every 10 years. And if you get a deep puncture wound and you don't know when your last booster was, or even if you do, you should talk to a doctor about getting a booster because you really don't want to go through this. Now, most bacteria are susceptible to some form of antibiotics. Antibiotics only work against bacteria. They don't do anything against a virus. So if you have a child with an ear infection, for example, most ear infections are caused by viruses. And antibiotics, yeah, they're not going to do anything. And of course, antibiotics have side effects. One of the most common is problems with the digestive tract, because they damage your own microbiome. There's an increased risk of disease caused by fungi. Your healthy microbiome has a balance between the fungi that live on and in our bodies and the bacteria. So if the bacteria get knocked down, well, the fungi can grow out of control and you can get things like yeast infections, jock itch, and athlete's foot. And let's not forget that some people have allergies to antibiotics, and those can be severe, life-threatening problems. Now, there's a new problem, well, not that new, with antibiotics, and that is antibiotic resistance. Going back to that picture of my friend with the big scar down her arm, that bacteria was resistant to most antibiotics, which meant that it was able to rage out of control despite her being given antibiotics. The antibiotics didn't work. Now, antibiotic resistance usually occurs on something called a plasmid. A plasmid is a small circular piece of DNA. They're not in the primary DNA of the bacteria. They're off to the side. And they're kind of optional. The bacteria does not need this plasmid, this antibiotic resistance plasmid, unless it gets exposed to antibiotic resistance. Now, plasmids can give them, there's a lot of different genes that can be passed from bacteria to bacteria on plasmids, including antibiotic resistance, but also being able to eat novel foods, changes in the ability to infect individuals, and there is resistance to all of our antibiotics. There are a few bacteria that have been found that don't respond to any antibiotics that we have available in the market today. Bacteria used to be a major, major cause of death. If you listen to the germ theory lecture, plague is a bacteria. Plague kills between 50 and 70% of people it infects unless they're treated. So think about that one if you really want to be scared. Why do we have this problem of resistance? Well, some of it is just evolution. It's what's going to happen. Some bacteria is going to have some genetic tweak that makes it survive exposure to antibiotics. And then you come in and you treat with antibiotics, and the one that's resistant to the drugs can now take over and grow. Now, this resistance, we say the word resistant to indicate that it starts out being able to survive low levels of antibiotics. But if you only expose it to low levels of antibiotics, it can start to be able to tolerate and survive in even higher levels of antibiotics. And this is a problem because of the way we overuse antibiotics in our society. We give low doses to farm animals because for some reason we don't know, it helps cattle grow faster. And if you have cattle in a stockyard situation or chickens in a big indoor chicken house where they're very crowded together, you give antibiotics to, kind of prevent diseases. But it's low level, which means you can increase resistance. Doctors have been giving antibiotics out for anything and everything that makes people sick because it's something they can do. There's not a lot that can be done for most viral infections except supportive care and waiting it out. So the doctor gives you an antibiotic so that they and you feel like the doctor's doing something. And a lot of people, when they start feeling better, quit taking the antibiotics, which means that the level in their bloodstream is low, and they quit taking it because they're feeling better, because they killed off most of the bacteria, but not all. To make matters worse, bacteria can do something called conjugation. Conjugation is a process where bacteria connect to each other. They kind of form this tube between two individual bacteria, and they can pass genetic information back and forth. Yeah, pretty much plasmids. And bacteria are not picky about who they conjugate with. For example, a botulinum bacteria can conjugate with an E. coli bacteria or a tetanus bacteria. They don't care. It's kind of like if you were going out there and mating with, pigeons. That's kind of gross when you think about it. This is not the only way antibiotic resistance can spread from bacteria to bacteria. They have lots of ways of picking up new bits of DNA. There are bacteriophages. These are viruses that infect bacteria and can carry plasmids from one to another. Heck, they can even pick it up from the environment. If you've got antibiotic resistance bacteria and it's sitting on your desk and you put a different bacteria on the surface, hang on, let me put this back. You've got dead antibiotic resistance bacteria on your desk. New bacteria come along, they can pick up those plasmids from the dead bacteria. Blech. So, what can we do to help with this problem? Well, a lot of things are things that reduce infections in general. Hand washing, soap and water. You don't need antibiotics in your soap, and we shouldn't allow antibiotics in the soap. Don't use antibiotics just in case. Oh, I knew somebody who had an infection and I was kissing them and I may have gotten their infection. No. Try and avoid consuming animal products if the animals were raised with antibiotics. Now this one's tricky because it's going to be more expensive and these things aren't always labeled well. Cook your food. Cook it well, especially things like chicken. Practice safe sex. If you're going to have sex, condoms, people. That prevents the spread of most STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. And get vaccinated. A lot of the vaccines that we have out there are for diseases that are difficult to treat and have high levels of mortality associated with them. Things like tetanus. Woo! That one ran long. This is kind of my jam here, infectious diseases. So I think we're probably going to have longer than normal lectures this week and next week.